available very soon. This year, the University of Richmond's MLK Celebration theme was inspired by one less quoted line from Dr. King's very often quoted 1963 I Have a Dream speech, the line, "We cannot walk alone." In his work, Dr. King was surrounded by fellow activists and strategists, including his chief strategist, Wyatt Tee Walker, and Walker's wife, Teresa Ann Walker. We are honored today to have an esteemed panel with us to explore Wyatt Tee Walker's legacy. Dr. Thad Williamson and Dr. Betty Neal Crutcher, who taught the fall 2021 course titled Reimagining American Democracy, Learning from the Life of Wyatt Tee Walker, are here alongside two students from their class, Sogona Cisse and Jacob Griffin. And we are also delighted to be joined by Taylor McNeilly, processing and reference archivist at Boatwright Memorial Library, who supported the class this past fall and knows the collection so well. Please do share any questions you have in the chat as the presentation unfolds, and I will now turn it over to Drs. Williamson and Crutcher.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see all of you here, and Dr. Betty Crutcher and I are both really pleased to have this opportunity alongside Taylor McNeilly to discuss this archive and this course with all of you. So Dr. Betty and I are both going to share some brief comments about what motivated this class and its focus on Wyatt Tee Walker, and then Taylor is going to share what's in the archives, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit literally about the structure of the class and hear from our students who are going to share some of what they did for their final projects that were presented in December. So the course we offered was called Reimagining American Democracy, Learning from the Life of Wyatt Tee Walker. And the phrase reimagining American democracy, I think, means for us, imagining that we can transition from being a society in which formally democratic processes rest atop a foundation of white supremacy. Imagine we can transition from that into a fully inclusive multiracial democracy in which all individuals can thrive and in which no group stands in relationships of domination or subordination to any other group. So Wyatt Tee Walker not only shared that vision, he worked to make it happen. He had a historical understanding of the realities of American society, specifically slavery and its long legacy. He had a moral commitment to respecting all persons and a specific commitment to the uplift and liberation of Black Americans. And he saw the Black church and the civil rights movements as instruments of that liberation. He was a tough and unsentimental tactician when confronting entrenched power and a skilled and thorough organizer of collective action. He was not averse to conflict when it's called for. Yet, like Martin Luther King Jr., he also had a deeply Christian philosophy of assertive nonviolent resistance that recognized the humanity of everyone, including adversaries. And maybe less recognized, he had a global vision of democracy triumphing over racism, informed by his extensive travel, by his capacity to recognize, appreciate, and respect people from very different religious, national, and political backgrounds, and by a commitment to supporting anti-racist struggles worldwide, even when they were not popular. And lastly, or perhaps first, he had an incredible scholarly and spiritual understanding of the Black musical tradition and its contributions not only to the survival of Black people in this racist country, but to the survival of American democracy itself. Wyatt Tee Walker was sometimes called the Renaissance Man of Harlem, and this is certainly not a false description. His life and work represents a model for reimagining American democracy. He is not the only model, of course, and Dr. Betty and I in our course also pointed students to contrasting visions of civil rights leadership, including that of Ella Baker, who we just heard the song about. But Dr. Walker's life and the archive he left, the University of Richmond, offers a treasure trove for considering a multitude of leadership questions, all of which carry implications for the continuing struggle for democracy in the 21st century. In the last few weeks alone, we have lost giants of the global civil rights struggle like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the actor Sidney Poitier, their passing, juxtaposed with the perils democracy faces today, compels us to reassess and re-examine their lives and work and the lessons and implications they carry for today. Our examination of the life of Wyatt Tee Walker, though in my mind is only just beginning, offers a model of how this can be done. This work of integrating past, present, and future should be at the center of what a University of Richmond education offers.
Thank you, Thad. Good afternoon, everyone. I can imagine how you look out there in the world, in your community, in our community. Thank you for joining us today. I join Professor Thad Williamson and Taylor McNeilly, archivist, and our dedicated University of Richmond students as we honor the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday and to acknowledge at birthday week and to acknowledge one of his fellow leaders of the civil rights movement, Reverend Dr. Wyatt Tee Walker, who was, as Thad mentioned, a Renaissance person in his ability to lead, to write, to organize, and to strategize. My heart is full of gratitude for the opportunity to co-teach with Professor Thad Williamson, to listen to our esteemed classroom guest, who many of you might know, who knew Reverend Dr. Wyatt Tee Walker, and to share together in new discoveries at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts exhibit on the Dirty South and at the Black History Museum here in Richmond. Many thanks also to our students, Sogona, Cisse, and Jacob Griffin, who are with us today to share with you their class experience. We have all worked cross-culturally to uncover the depth of racism and classism and sexism and how to bring these issues into the public consciousness. We are moving forward with the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King here at the University of Richmond, where we are learning side by side, reflecting that there was a moment in time where learning together was not possible. Yes, at the University of Richmond, at a time in the past, learning side by side was not possible. Some of the students shared with us that they wish much of what they had learned this past semester that they had learned earlier in their educational studies. Together, we recognize that the magic of learning something new every day for the purposes of understanding why things must change and how to implement that change is one way of reimagining American democracy. In studying the life of Reverend Dr. Wyatt Tee Walker, we read about his values of standing up for truth and demanding equality for all, his virtues of courage, perseverance, and resilience, and his vision that enabled him to hold on to his purpose and mission despite many obstacles. We also express great admiration to Mrs. Wyatt Tee Walker and their children for all their courage and sacrifices. This has inspired all of us to follow their examples and to continue to move forward together cross-culturally with hope and healing and common bonds without wounding one another, no matter what the difficulties. We who believe in freedom shall not rest. Thank you for joining us for this lunch and learning time and for the organizers of this lunch and learning time. Thad?
So thank you very much, Dr. Reddy. And so now we're going to turn over things to Taylor McNeilly, the archivist for his collection, who worked with each of us, going back nearly a year to organize this class, help us understand the materials in it, and really has been a full partner in this endeavor. And he knows an insane amount about this collection. So we've asked him to share just some of that with you. He could go on for 4 or 5 hours, but he's going to do the best he can in just a few minutes. So thank you, Taylor.
Thank you, Dr. Williamson, and thank you, Dr. Crutcher. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, everybody can see that, right? We're good, perfect. Okay, so as Dr. Crutcher and Williamson, as well as Sylvia, have said, my name is Tanner McNeilly. I'm the reference and processing archivist here. And I'm going to talk to you just very briefly about the Dr. and Mrs. Wyatt Tee Walker Collection. So the donation paperwork for this was signed in 2015, just as President Crutcher sort of came onto the scene here at U of R. I won't get too into the technical details about this sort of stuff, but we did not actually start getting material until 2016, and we continue to receive material today. We're hoping to have the full collection by the end of the year. But as Mrs. Walker goes through her things, we're getting more and more material. So right at the outset, I'm telling you, we don't have everything yet. So I can't give you a comprehensive inventory, but we're working on it. So to start with, I want to give you a brief overview of the Reverend Dr. Wyatt Tee Walker's life, as well as his wife, Teresa Ann. I'm not going to read this word for word. I don't have time, and I don't think you want to hear me do that, but just know that this is a brief summary of things that he has done in his life. He's born in Massachusetts, grew up in New Jersey, came down to Virginia for schooling, got 2 bachelor's degrees at VUU, and then immediately turned around and went into their seminary. As soon as he graduated from his seminary, he's called to Guilford Baptist Church in Petersburg. And at this point, it's probably his senior year at Virginia Union when he meets the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for the first time. So for those of you who aren't aware, in the 1950s, African Americans could not get together in groups legally. That was not allowed. They would be arrested. And so a lot of these seminaries had an interseminary group. And Walker was head of his interseminary and King was head of his. And so when VUU hosted Crozer, they met that way, became fast friends and stayed friends through the rest of King's regrettably short life. So during his time at Guilford Baptist, which is itself a very historic church, Walker starts doing a lot of activism. We'll talk about his activism in the next slide, but he's very active there, stays in touch with King. And so when King finds himself in need of a full-time executive director of his organization, SCLC, he taps Walker. Walker and his family move to Atlanta. They are there for about 4 years. He leaves SCLC. I can tell you stories about that. But after that, he sort of wanders for a little bit, does a number of things, and then is called to be the senior pastor at Canaan Baptist Church of Christ in Harlem. He's there for 37 years, is actually installed by Dr. King 2 weeks before King's assassination. It is King's last sermon that he preaches in New York City. 37 years later, he suffers a number of strokes and retires from Canaan Baptist, continues working. He teaches at a seminary, I think it's United Theological in Dayton, for a number of years, continues to be active as a scholar, donated his collection, and unfortunately passed away in January of 2018. So, activism. This man did not stop for a moment. He did a lot. Again, this is a brief overview. He's arrested a lot. He did a number of integrations in Petersburg before moving on to SCLC. He was the head of a number of activist organizations, such as the regional NAACP and the state director of CORE. He was a freedom rider along with his wife. And then he moves on to SCLC. As Dr. Williamson noted, he is, and actually I think Sylvia also mentioned, that he was the lead strategist as well as the first full-time executive director. So he's the mind behind Project C, Project Confrontation in Birmingham, as well as one of the minds behind the 1963 March on Washington. So he's heavily involved here. I'll show you a little bit in the collection about that. But he's a very close friend of King through all of this, and organized his funeral. We'll talk more about that as well later. And then turns his attention internationally. Becomes a close friend of Nelson Mandela. He's a very vocal anti-apartheid activist, and was an election monitor for the first full democratic South African election in 1994. So this guy, like, he just kept, and again, this is brief, I'm skipping a lot, but he did a lot, I promise. He is, as Dr. Williamson mentioned, also a noted scholar. He wrote approximately 50 books. About 30 of these have been published. Some of them have been translated into multiple languages. He is a preeminent scholar of ethnomusicology, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but very heavily focused on African-American music and the role of Black gospel. Traveled and preached on 5 of the different continents. Okay, I'm going to skip a bunch of this, but he's a co-founder, a very strong proponent of charter schools. He was a businessman. He was an affordable housing developer. He was in government and politics. He was also an accomplished photographer. And I always love to mention that he was a champion golfer. He literally did not stop, ever. I don't think the man slept. Just nonstop stuff. It is also important to note at this point, before I move on, that we do have material from Mrs. Walker, Teresa, and that she is herself a significant figure in civil rights. She was a freedom rider, and she was a full-time mother while participating in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. So, I mean, she survived a hotel bombing, survived jail for about a week. You did a lot of amazing things on her own. She doesn't get a slide because I'm cutting a bunch of stuff, but Mrs. Walker is also an amazing person, and we do have material from her in the collection. So what is in the collection? Hopefully understanding some of what Dr. Walker did, you understand when I say that the collection is immense. It takes up about 2 rooms in the library, as well as an offsite storage unit. There's a lot. And this is still undergoing processing. I can talk about what that means in more detail if folks are interested, but suffice to say that I haven't put hands on everything, so I can't tell you about every single item in the collection, but we're working on it. So the bulk of it is manuscript material. That primarily means paper documents. But we do have a lot of audiovisual material. So we've got vinyl records, we've got 8mm film, we've got a reel of reel-to-reel audio. These numbers are correct on the screen: 835 audio cassette tapes, uncounted VHS and DVDs, a lot of photographs, have not counted those either, but we do have approximately 15,000 Kodak slides, as well as some photo negatives, a number of posters, and more stuff. So that's really, I really want to impress how large that is. A lot of audiovisual material. We do have about 200 individual awards, honors, and citations. Those are both to Dr. Walker and Mrs. Walker. They were both heavily awarded. Doctor more than Mrs., and we can have a conversation about why that is in American culture, that we value men more, but that's a whole other thing. We do also have some textile items, robes that he collected or preached in, as well as his personal library, and an oral history that the university conducted in 2016. It's actually a 2-day recording, very interesting. So a couple examples of stuff in the collection, just to sort of help. Manuscript material, here you see a couple of different examples. On the left is some correspondence from Dr. Walker's time at SCLC. You can see there, King has written on the top, "Let Wyatt handle this." The bulk of the correspondence we have is labeled in this way. King was addressed a lot. He got a lot of letters, and almost always those letters, he just said, "Let Wyatt deal with it." Wyatt really was his right-hand man for these 4 years, and he handled a lot of the day-to-day operations. On the right here, you can see a different kind of example of manuscript material. These are handwritten notes from Mrs. Walker, detailing her time in jail as a freedom rider. So we do get the printed material as well as the handwritten material, and you can see that Mrs. Walker's notes have been foldered. That's sort of a brief look at what processing does. So I organize things into folders so I know what's there and where to find it later. But just a couple of examples of what those look like. Next up are the film reels. I like to show these off for people who maybe never handled 8mm film or really know what that means. On the left, you can see the stack of all 5 of them. On the right, one of them is open with a ruler just to give you an idea of size. So we did have 5 of these in the collection, and I'll talk about how we handled these. As you can imagine, not many people can just sit down with an 8mm film reel and watch it. That's an outdated technology. So I can talk more about how we handle that as questions come in. Audio cassettes, and I love to show this because this is what 835 audio cassettes look like. Please don't miss those couple of boxes under the counter as well. That larger box on the left that's sitting on top of some of the cassettes is actually the reel-to-reel audio reel. This is the way a lot of collections come in. This material is boxed. Somebody has taken the time to put things in boxes to move them, but they're not necessarily well organized beyond that. So when I talk about we digitized the audio cassettes, I had to go through every single one and organize them chronologically to ensure that we had some level of intellectual control. So again, I can talk about that more if folks are interested, but just to give you an idea of what that looks like, that's 800 cassettes for you. Next up are slides. I'm not sure how many of you are too young to know what a slide is, but here's a good look at some of the slide carousels. As I said, Dr. Walker was a photographer, prolific in his photography, and was also heavily photographed as a subject. So we do have about 15,000 of these. They are well organized, so it doesn't take too much work to move through them. If you can read that little sticky note left by my predecessor, she got through 6,110 slides of the 15,000. And if you nice little note, start here, right? These haven't been done yet. But you can tell that they're in the carousel, so they're pretty easily identified as to which event, which travel, which trip, what country are they in, that sort of stuff, which makes it much easier to handle. Now, again, sort of moving on the photographs image idea. Here are a couple examples of some of the photographs in the collection. Again, I don't know all of them. I cannot count them for you, maybe someday. But for now, here's just a couple examples. The triptych you see at the top, the 2 photographs on the right are a pair. You may recognize that middle one as a fairly common photo of King. This is actually one that Walker took himself. He smuggled a camera into jail and took the photo of King, and then King turned around and took that photo of Walker on the right. And down at the bottom right, that color photograph is actually King, President Mandela on his first trip to America as president, Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton at Canaan Baptist Church. One of the first stops that Mandela made on this first official visit was Walker's church because they were so close. Ooh, just running right through. Some digital material. I don't think I mentioned it aloud, but it was on an earlier slide that we do have digital material. Again, a nice little illustration for those who might be too young to know what a hard floppy is. This is what a floppy disk looks like. We get a lot of these. As you can tell, Toshiba Special Enhancements is maybe not something super pertinent to the collection. This happens a lot, and I can talk about it again. Right? We also have like WordPerfect installation disks. We don't need WordPerfect installation disks, but these things often come in with collections. And so how we handle that is another thing I'm happy to talk about. But just to show you that we do have these things in the collection. Here's a couple of things that I really like to point out as sort of points of interest that we found so far. Here are 2 letters, one from King and one from his widow, Coretta Scott. On the left is the one from King. You might, those with a good eye, notice that it is actually signed Mike. That was King's birth name. His father changed both of their names after a pilgrimage. But this letter is actually from the latter portion of Walker's time here in the Richmond area, writing in support of an action that Walker was planning for New Year's Day of 1959. And on the right is a letter from Coretta Scott King, thanking Walker for organizing and managing King's funeral. Walker states in the oral history that organizing King's funeral was the crowning achievement of his organizational career. He felt very strongly about that. The only other manuscript item that I really love to call out is that we actually have Walker's unpublished biography of Martin Luther King Jr. It is one of 2 copies we know exist, so it's pretty precious to us and very unique given Walker's friendship with King. Next up, we do have the election ballot, the sample ballot from the 1994 South African election. Y'all might have seen this if you were on campus during South Africa Week a few years ago, or during our first fall symposium. I think we showed it off. But as I said, he was an election monitor for that election, and this is the sample ballot he was given to sort of help folks understand how to vote. I really love it. One of the candidates was from Cisse, the Cisse party, for Keep It Simple and Something. I love it. It's great. So we really love to show this off again, just sort of showing that international activism. Next up is an image of the music tree. This poster is about 3 feet by 5. You can see it's quite large. When Walker got his master's degree, he focused on ethnomusicology, and this was part of that thesis work. So if you look at the bottom, the roots of the tree are slave utterances, chants and moans and cries. In the course, we talked about that a little bit. President Crutcher came in, but Dr. Walker's focus was really talking about how these slave utterances are the roots for most modern American music. And on the left, you can see a lot of popular or secular music styles, and he sort of shows how they branched off. And on the right is the religious side of that tree. So this is sort of the start of his ethnomusicology. He continued to work on this through the rest of his life. But this is one piece that really shows the base of that scholarship. We do have smaller sized images of this as well. It's not just a giant laminated poster, but it's really interesting. And here I told you he was a champion golfer, and I did not lie, and here is the evidence. This is about a 4-foot tall trophy. He won this in the Bahamas, of all places. There's a really great story from the family about this championship. I'm happy to tell if folks have interest in time later during Q&A, but I just like to make sure that folks, I say he's a champion golfer, and when I say it, I mean it, just to sort of highlight that this is there. We do have some very interesting pieces in the collection. Next up, here's a sort of brief description of the current status of the collection itself. So as I said, it's not fully processed, which means it's not all open to research. We did focus on digitization of a lot of that audiovisual material. Cassettes, magnetic recordings tend to last about 40 years before they start to degrade. The cassettes started in 1980 and run through the 2000s, so those were not too risky, but the film reels were certainly of concern, as well as the reel-to-reel audio piece. So those were digitized first and are mostly online. The cassettes are all available on site, and we're working to make them available online. But there's like 3 of us in the department, so please give me some time. The manuscript portion is not fully open yet. We're planning to open that in chunks as the processing continues. As you can imagine, the pandemic sort of slowed that work down, but it's happening. We do use it a lot in courses. Reimagining American Democracy was the first time that we did sort of a semester-long course, but it does go in for sort of one-off instruction sessions in other courses. Dr. Walker donated the collection here in part because he wanted it to be a teaching collection, and he wanted it to reach an audience that it might not otherwise reach if the collection was not here. And so we feel that this is really important to do, and that's why we sort of make sure that that is out there. But any faculty who are listening in, if you want, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to bring material in. We have held 2 symposia and shared bits of it out for exhibit. Two pieces were loaned out to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture for their Determined exhibition. 2 years ago now, I guess. We do have some material online, as I said, and there's a straight link. It's honestly easier if you talk to me about it because things are sort of scrolled away in different places. And I do give blog updates on that second link if you want to see sort of how the collection is progressing. So that's it. Try to keep this tight. Sorry it was as long as it was. Hopefully it was interesting. Anybody who does have questions that we either don't get to today or you don't feel comfortable asking in public, you can feel free to either email or call me. I would suggest email because I'm not always in the office, but either works. And I'm happy to answer questions about this or our other holdings, as needed. So thank you so much. And I will hand this back to Drs. Williamson and Crutcher.
All right. Thank you, Taylor. And that was admirably compact, given the vast amount of stuff that's in there. And so as you can see from this presentation, it was a little bit of a challenge to figure out how to organize this into a course. And so, Dr. Bennett, I want to say just a few words about that before we get to the main event, which is hearing from our students. So we didn't assume any prior knowledge for students in the class. There was no prerequisites or anything. So we did start with looking at 2 recent 1-volume histories of the Black church and the civil rights movement to provide grounding for understanding Walker's life. But then we looked at in detail at the Birmingham campaign of 1963, which Walker considered to be the pivotal moment of the movement. And we use an incredibly detailed book, Carry Me Home by Diane McWhorter. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning book that has a very informed portrait of both white and Black Birmingham at the time and the preceding history, as well as a blow-by-blow account of the organizing. So that was our focus on civil rights. But then we looked at his career as a pastor at Canaan Baptist in New York and looked at a number of essays he wrote on theological issues, on church administration issues, on civil rights and political issues of the 70s and 80s, and also listened to one of his sermons in class. And he has to respond to question and chat. The archive does include an incredible array of audio sermons. And also what I really appreciate is it includes the whole service, not just the sermon. So you can hear the music and the other prayers involved. So you can hear it in context. And lastly, another holding of the archive are a couple of essentially self-published books that Walker wrote later on in his career. One is about his firsthand account of going with Jesse Jackson to free Lieutenant Robert Goodman from Syria in early 1984, which is absolutely fascinating. And second, his account of being an international election observer in the 1994 South African elections, which of course transitioned that society from apartheid to democracy. So that's the substance of what we covered, but now Dr. Bates can talk about the way we did it.
Thanks, Professor Williamson. But the form of the class was as important to us as the content. We began each class with a piece of music that Dr. Williamson generally and mostly selected, and I sang along with it to help center us and also make sure we were all alert at 9 a.m. on Friday mornings. We then, in the first part of the class, discussed the assigned text in guided discussions from 9 a.m. until 10:20 a.m. In the second part of each class meeting from 10:30 a.m. to 11:45, we had a variety of class speakers. These included Reverend Walker's daughter, Mrs. Patrice Walker Powell, University of Faculty member and former president of the University of Richmond, Dr. Ronald A. Crutcher, Dr. Laurinette Lee, Dr. Andrea Simpson, and Dr. Gil Hickman. Doctors Corey D.B. Walker and Dr. Beth Hopkins of Wake Forest University were also virtually present. Dr. Beth Hopkins, attorney Beth Hopkins, came to the class with Dr. Walker's daughter. We also had ministers from the community, including Pastors Tyrone Nelson and Reverend Yvonne Jones Bibbs of the Sixth Mount Zion Baptist Church and Sixth Baptist Church here in Richmond. Community members and friends included Reverend Michael Hickman, Mrs. Yvette Harris, and Mr. Leslie Skip Griffin, a plaintiff in the Prince Edward County massive resistance case, and attorney Sue Thompson, the first Black woman to graduate from the University of Alabama Law School in the 1970s. We also took field trips to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts to see its Dirty South exhibit and to the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. A goal throughout the class was to encourage students to further develop their own voices and analysis. To that end, for the last class period, students made final presentations. Two of those students are with us today. Sogona, Miss Sogona Cisse, and Mr. Jacob Griffin. From Sogona is from the New York area, and Jacob is from the Chicago area. And now you will hear their voices as they share some of the excerpts from their presentation. Take it away, students.
Okay, I believe I'm going first. Alexandra, are you sharing my presentation? Okay, perfect. My name is Sogona Cisse. I'm a first-year student. I'm at the University of Richmond. I'm from the Bronx in New York City, and I'm an intended global studies and leadership studies double major. So my presentation and final project for this course decided to focus on the global aspects of Wyatt Tee Walker's leadership and activism. Before I go into my presentation, though, I'd like to just point out that this class was my favorite class last semester. It was super interesting. And I always tell my friends, it's like the only class I'd be willing to wake up at 9 o'clock in the morning for on a Friday morning. So I think Professors Williamson and Professor Crutcher did an amazing job with this class. I thought Taylor was super helpful and super knowledgeable with the collection and made research a lot easier, I guess, when it came to this final project. So I'm going to begin with my introduction. So what I decided to focus on, there's gonna be some stuff on the slides that I'm not necessarily referring to in order to make it compact, but essentially I was focusing on how Walker empathized with the comparable plight of people of color in other parts of the world, like South Africa and Palestine, in addition to the activism he was doing in the United States. So his status shifted to that of a global citizen as he considered his work for civil rights incomplete without committing himself to the liberation of people of color abroad, in addition to the United States. So you can skip to the activism and the civil rights slide. Okay, yes, here we go. So Walker's leadership in Petersburg, Virginia, as well as the success of his undertakings stood out to Martin Luther King Jr. and played a role in his invitation to Walker to be the executive director of SCLC, which was really important. So he was heavily involved in Petersburg. He organized the Petersburg Improvement Association and was really good at organizing and gathering the people of Petersburg. So he actually antagonized some Black and white people in the area just because he was very unafraid and unabashed in his efforts to gather people in the fight against segregation. He considered his success of Project C in Birmingham as his biggest accomplishment, as well as his legacy. So in an interview, he said, that was the turning point in the desegregation struggle. My organizational skills were best used in Birmingham in that campaign. I would like to be remembered as the man who desegregated America because the Birmingham campaign led directly to the desegregation of the nation. And I thought that made complete sense that he'd like to be considered the person who organized the one event that I guess toppled Jim Crow in the South, because he utilized important strategies such as the Gandhian nonviolent resistance theory, where if you're protesting peacefully and your adversaries are violent in their response, I guess bystanders and people looking on are more likely to empathize with you. And that was the case with Project C. There was a lot of international and national backlash to how people were treated. So that just goes to show how strategic Wyatt Tee Walker was. We can go to the next slide. So Wyatt Tee Walker's Pan-Africanism was also very important, his Pan-Africanism as well as his anti-apartheid activism. So as you read this quote or this exchange on the screen, I think it's evident that Walker thought it was imperative for African Americans and Black people in the United States to understand their roots, because it would be impossible to fully understand the civil rights movement without understanding the origins of the discrimination they were combating, which is white supremacy. So he considered it white supremacy like a global phenomenon, something that's not exclusive to just the United States. And he also, in his book, Soweto Diary, recounted a moment where he becomes emotional about the liberation of South Africa, which is similar to the happy tears his colleague and friend Martin Luther King had when he was in attendance for Ghana's independence under Kwame Nkrumah. So even though Wyatt Tee Walker wasn't at Ghana's independence, he was there with South Africa, and he, I guess, felt like he related to the tears that Martin Luther King had, just because both of them had like this elation that came with seeing the success of a freedom movement for Black oppressed people. And I think they both also recognize the interrelated state of the people of the African diaspora, whether they are in Africa or in the United States. They're both dealing with forces of white supremacy that are completely similar, even though it's on two different continents. So you can go to the next slide. You can skip this slide. You can skip this slide as well. Okay, so the next slide I wanted to focus on was the global consciousness section of my final project. So an important part of Walker's leadership was the fact that he understood that the liberation struggle was universal among people of color. So he often reiterated his belief that international affairs were every bit as important as domestic affairs, and also encouraged Black leaders, especially in the church, to be vocal about global issues that also affected domestic relations. And I thought this was notable because, after all, it was the backlash from countries abroad that prompted action from the federal government during the civil rights movement, considering the fact that the Cold War backdrop during the 1960s was incredibly relevant to the activism taking place at the time, because the national coverage of the brutal treatment of Black Americans tarnished the image of the United States overseas. And this obviously wasn't ideal, especially when you consider the global binary that was taking place at the time, communism versus capitalism or democracy. So another quote that I thought was important that was on the screen, that's on the screen now, is Wyatt Tee Walker's friend and colleague, M. William Howard Jr., who talked about how Okay, so the quote says, "Finally, through the whole tour, I kept seeing the genius of the African experience at work, regretting through this and most of my growing international experience how America has failed so miserably to use this great natural resource effectively to help solve international crises." So essentially, he's referring to the trip they had taken to Damascus, Syria, to help secure the freedom of an American prisoner. This was a trip taken by Wyatt Tee Walker, Jesse Jackson, and other people as a part of their delegation. So essentially, Howard is pointing to how the Black people who were coming from the United States were able to relate to, I guess, the other people abroad, just because they have that shared experience of like being affected by white supremacy, which is what he mentions. And like, there's something in the suffering of the ex-slave which lends itself to cultivating understanding among peoples of vastly diverse backgrounds. So I believe he's saying that because this delegation that went to Damascus was so diverse and had a lot of different people, particularly Black people, they were able to secure the freedom of this prisoner, which was something the government wasn't previously able to do, being like a white male dominated government. You can go to the next slide. So another important aspect of my presentation was the political power of Blackness. So the success of the civil rights movement did not mean the end of Wyatt Tee Walker's participation in other human rights struggles. As Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, one of our guest speakers, indicated during his visit to our class, Blackness was a national vision with global dimensions. And I think that speaks directly to Wyatt Tee Walker's life. Dr. Corey D.B. Walker described the relationship between Black people in the United States and how they connect to various issues. And I think that explained Wyatt Tee Walker's mindset of viewing other oppressed people's struggles as similar to the plight of African Americans. And because he was such a well-traveled man, I think he really understood just how global white supremacy was and how it permeated the world beyond the United States. So yeah, the last thing I'd like to mention before I conclude is an important aspect of Walker's leadership was his commitment to the decisions and projects he agreed to, despite the obstacles in his way that inhibited true democracy. So for example, in the United States, the struggle for civil rights was obviously no easy feat. He was jailed 17 times and his children couldn't even play outside without someone monitoring them because of death threats his family always got. And when he shifted his focus to the global struggle for human rights, his life was endangered. For instance, when he was in Syria and also when he was in South Africa, there was a lot of violence on the ground, and yet he still didn't back out. And I think that's a representation of a truly admirable leader. So that's the end of my presentation. You guys can feel free to add any questions you might have in the chat section of the Zoom.
Thank you, Sogona. Jacob, you're up.
Awesome, thank you. My name is Jacob Griffin. I'm a senior from just north of Chicago, leadership studies and political science double major. And my project, I decided to kind of focus on maybe a lesser known or even road less traveled part of Dr. Walker's life, which was his impact in the education space. I'm going to start with this quote that I felt was, extremely important. It kind of came a couple of years before Dr. Walker's death. In an interview, he said, "It is education that will guarantee that segregation and second-class citizenship will never return." And I just feel that, COVID has exacerbated these inequities that we still have in our public education system. And Dr. Walker was really one to take control and take things into his own hands when the government wasn't doing their job. And this kind of started, really early on in his, activist career, actually in 1959, when massive resistance was going on in the state of Virginia, where people in government were opposing the desegregation of schools after Brown v. Board. He organized multiple marches, including a pilgrimage for prayer right here in Richmond, which I felt was a very important, precursor to what ended up being the first charter school in New York that he helped create. So the pilgrimage for prayer, he took, a group of about 1,500 people in Richmond protesting, and they used audio recording of Dr. King to kind of fire people up in this march that was, very impactful and was kind of one of the early, feats of his activism. So education was clearly really important to Dr. Walker. He called it the next frontier of civil rights. And I believe that that is absolutely true. And because of this, when he became the pastor at Canaan Baptist, he was focused on the city of Harlem in other ways, including, affordable housing, working with the governor, as well as getting drugs off the street, especially in his community. But when he was approached by, a couple of people who wanted to change kind of the education system, people brought him the idea of, creating a charter school. And so his church had actually just built a community center, and they were unsure, I guess, exactly how they were going to use this community center, but it ended up being the perfect site for New York's first charter school. And at this school, the children who went, there were definitely challenges. There were issues between the separation of church and state because they wanted Dr. Walker on the board. That ended up not happening, which I felt really showed his humility. Dr. Walker's also quoted saying that he believed that if Dr. King was still with us today, he would not only emphatically support charter schools, but he would be right there with him fighting the same civil rights fight of the 20th century, as he called it, or the 21st century. So this charter school was named the Cisse Walker Charter School of Harlem, and it was originally just the Cisse Charter School, but they ended up naming it after Walker just because of how profound his impact was in this community and in the children of District 5 public schools in New York. And I think it's really important to note that, throughout the civil rights movement, Dr. Walker was, maybe a lesser known figure. I could ask family and friends and they had no idea, who he was. And I just think that this class was so important, and my favorite class that I've ever taken at the University of Richmond. And I truly do mean that. His life is so important to understanding the civil rights movement and to understanding how successful each and every protest, each and every project that he was a part of was. And it went further than the United States, as Sogona mentioned. And I just felt that, education maybe wasn't the center of his focus always, but it definitely was later in his life. And I truly feel that today still there are inequities in our public education system, and that, that's how I wanted to reimagine American democracy using Dr. Walker's life. So thank you, Dr. Williamson and Dr. Crutcher and Taylor, for your help with my research. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Thank you, Jacob and Sogona. We're obviously proud of both of you. And I think even the presentations, you see the many different directions that Reverend Walker's life took, and the roads and pathways he explored. And yet, in a sense, it's all of a piece. And we don't have time to discuss what he would be saying today, but there is something circular, I guess, in history. I mean, you can consider that his life and career, as was stated, basically started with opposing massive resistance, in Virginia. And so now we're at a moment where maybe we'll come back to that, another version of that same battle that will be fought out here. But I think we have a couple minutes for any questions, either by text or I think we can allow anyone to speak. And then Dr. Betty has a couple of final quotations she'd like to read. So any comments from questions for anyone?
Dad, I just dropped one in the chat, inviting any of you really to reflect for a moment on how your understanding of Dr. Walker's legacy deepens our understanding of the civil rights movement more broadly, in the context of so many reminders yesterday and ongoing that we like to reduce King's legacy and make it simple and palatable. And I'm curious to hear how this work helps us resist that tendency.
That's a great question. And this may not be a direct answer, but I think that there's two stories from Reverend Walker that stick out for me, at this particular moment. I mean, obviously that there are hundreds, but one is that, at a certain stage when King was in jail in Birmingham, there was an issue about whether he'd been allowed to call Coretta, and Coretta called Wyatt and said, "I'm worried, I haven't heard from him." And so he said to her, "Why don't you call the president, Kennedy, and get him to intervene," which he did. And then that became a way to pull Kennedy into this controversy in a way he hadn't been. So that was obviously, he was solving the immediate problem, which he did. And Martin did get to call Coretta, which is a good thing, and ask about their new child who had just been born. But now he basically manipulated John F. Kennedy into taking sides in this, which he had not been wanting to do. So that level of belief that you can do something. I mean, that's one thing. And a second thing is him going on with Jesse Jackson to liberate an American captive. And Jesse Jackson was running for president against Ronald Reagan, and yet they worked with the Reagan administration to secure clearance to do this trip. Pulled off this incredible feat of international diplomacy. And then Jesse Jackson comes back with Lieutenant Governor Goodman and meets with Reagan, in the Rose Garden. And then 2 weeks after that, Jesse Jackson is campaigning for president, blasting Reagan. And so that's just an amazing story to me. And I actually don't think it could happen today. because the partisan divide is so great. I just don't think that any part of that could actually happen. And Wyatt Tee Walker, he basically at a certain stage was the only person who actually committed to doing the trip, and he didn't realize it. And so he has to interrupt his Christmas with the church and with his family, and from watching the NFL playoffs to make a bunch of phone calls to get people on board to do this trip and convince people they could actually do it. And they pulled it off. And Walker's only protest to Reagan was he refused to go to the Rose Garden ceremony. Instead, he went straight home to be with his wife when it was all done. But that sort of sense that like faith, but also the competency that you can do anything, and that no bridge is too far, and it doesn't matter how powerful someone is, it's just a person, and it can be worked with. I think that's an incredible legacy, and I think that's at the heart of what leadership is. Sometimes we draw there's these big impermeable structures that we can't touch, and at the end of the day, it's just people, and you can always figure out a way to move Pharaoh or the president or whoever it is, Bull Connor or whoever it is you're trying to move. There's always a way. So that's what I take from both King and Walker's life at the moment. But Dr. Betty, I'm talking too much, so I want to hear from you and your words as well.
I would like to. It's a minute before our time is up, so I think you've given two clear examples. And perhaps since it is a minute, if there's not another question, Sylvia, will you allow us to maybe ask if there is another question, and then I'll close it out?
Yes, I do see Dr. Simpson with a hand up. And so let's hear your question, Dr. Simpson.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here, and I was happy to present to this wonderful class led by Dr. Williamson and Crutcher. I wanted to just answer a little bit of your question, Sylvia, and that is, as someone born and raised in Memphis and whose political consciousness was really cemented and fired up with my participation in the sanitation worker strike of 1968, I think that during King's birthday, and even in Black History Month, we focus on very few of the great minds and hearts of the movement. And Wyatt Tee Walker is left out a lot, simply because we're going to hear about, of course, Memphis, where he was assassinated, but Birmingham, Selma, those deep South states that had significant activity. And so I think it's so important for us to get in very important people like Reverend Walker and Ella Baker and Joanne Robinson and Fannie Lou Hamer. And there's so many unsung heroes out there. So I think it helps to do that. I remember going to see X, the movie by Malcolm X. And at the time, my friend and I were one of the few Blacks in the theater, and the theater was packed. It was packed to the gills with Middle Eastern citizens of Atlanta. And it really struck me, and it made me realize how universal, themes of freedom and democracy are held by people.
That's such a powerful image. Thank you, Dr. Simpson, for adding that. I wish we were in person, because this is when we want to linger together and continue the conversation, but I'm mindful of our time. I'm going to pass back to you, Dr. Crutcher, to offer your final comments, and then we will say goodbye. And I'll just note that there's a link to a survey in the chat, and folks, that is really going to help us plan for next year's Martin Luther King celebration. So if you want more from Wyatt Tee Walker, more of this, please take a moment to note that. Thank you, Dr. Crutcher.
Thank you, and thank you all virtually for being present with us, and for the organizers. I would like to say, you see a name there, and she's probably going to be totally embarrassed, but the name Joanne Deck. I met Joanne about 13 years ago. Well, maybe not that long, but at a Martin Luther King nonviolent workshop. And she is white, and I, of course, am Black, and we walk side by side on in this work we call Jesus Calling work, or civil rights and justice work. And we talked about two quotes that I'd like to leave with you from this session today, and to thank you again for listening. especially to our students. We thank you. We're so proud of you. But the two quotes that I'd like to leave you with and with Joanne's voice there too, is the function of education is to teach one to think intensely and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of education. And that is a quote from Martin Luther King. And the other quote, and the last quote, is our goal is to create a beloved community. And this will require a qualitative change in our souls, as well as a quantitative change in our lives. And with that, thank you, thank you, thank you for being present with us today.
And thank you so much to all of our panelists, and to be continued on this important conversation.